Our next speaker, I haven't met him yet, but I think he's here from Europe. And without a long introduction, I want to take a lot from his talk. He's going to tell us about the subject we're very familiar with here in this country, political correctness. Tomislav Sunic. Dr. Sunic, we're happy to have you here. Here you are, okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me in the back? All right. Well, thank you for being here, first and foremost. And first, I'd like to thank Mr. Gordon Baum for his kind invitation. Also, I'd like to thank my friend James Edwards, who brought me here, and also to some kind people that have taken care of me. The reason I'm very pleased and honored to be with you is quite obvious. I'll tell you quite frankly. I like you very, very much, all the more as I've met many, quote-unquote, country club conservatives and bimbo conservatives who are usually very, very kind and all very much on our page, but when push comes to shove, then they seek for cover. And I like you because you are much more earthy, you are down to earth, and you are much more explicit in your beliefs. Yesterday we were discussing about political correctness. We mentioned a few issues. And I thought about giving you some discourse on the genesis of political correctness, particularly from the linguistical point of view and from the legal point of view, particularly as far as Germany is concerned, the German judiciary and the French judiciary. But then I thought I might just as well give you first and foremost the rundown on the situation in ex-Yugoslavia in the Balkans for a few minutes. After that, if you don't mind, I'd like to give you an idea of the legacy of communism and how this legacy of communism still operates in East and post-communist Europe. I'd like also to draw a distinction and a parallel between political correctness here in this so-called free country of the brave and all the rest, and the political correctness in ex-communist Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. And then towards the very end, I would like to tackle on the topic of victimology and victimhood, and how victimology and victimhood square away with our modern multiracialism. But the bottom line, in fact, I'm quite optimistic. The bottom line of my speech is that this ideology or this religion of victimhood will eventually lead to the destruction or to the decay of this multiracial society. So in this sense, I'm quite optimistic. Let me first start with just a brief survey of what's going on in the Balkans. I'm somewhat, I guess you are familiar a little bit what's going on in Eastern Europe, and particularly in what used to be Yugoslavia. I was born in the Yugoslav jurisdiction, and I was born, in fact, in a constituent republic of Yugoslavia, which is now known as a sovereign and separate Croatia. But I'm also a U.S. citizen, because I had to leave communist Yugoslavia. My dad, being a Catholic lawyer, quite a prominent lawyer, he went to prison in '83, and he was adopted by about 15 congressmen here in the States during Reagan's mandate. And anyway, he had quite a bit of he was 4 years in prison in communist Yugoslavia, and then I was granted political asylum here in the States. I did my graduate work in California, at the University of California, Santa Barbara. For some time, I was also working with Thomas Fleming with the Chronicles of American Culture. I also had a pleasure and honor to meet Pat Buchanan, and I was quite active on his campaign to some extent, of course. And to make the story short, in 1993, when Yugoslavia collapsed, when it fell apart, I returned with my wife. She's also of Croatian descent. We returned back to Croatia, and I was awarded, if you wish, with quite a prominent diplomatic position in the Croatian Foreign Service. After the end of the old man, as we call him, Franjo Tudjman, who was basically a revisionist, a staunch anti-communist, by the way, he had some problems with certain Jewish lobbies, both on the East Coast and also in Tel Aviv. In 2000, he passed away, and then, of course, also my career sort of went downhill. And I'm serious now. I'm reconsidering now coming back and relocating to the States and possibly finding a teaching position at some Christian conservative college. But this is just my daydream. We'll talk about this later. Anyway, the bottom line is, you may ask me what is going on in why did Yugoslavia fall apart? Why were Serbs and Croats involved in such a stupid and fratricidal conflict, which of course it's not to our advantage. And I'll be quite frank with you, I'm pretty much ashamed for what happened in ex-Yugoslavia. And I hate to say we should not make too many illusions about our white pride, if you want to put it that way, in a somewhat derogatory fashion. The fact of the matter is that in Europe, and particularly in Eastern Europe, there is still a great deal of tension between different ethnic groups. So we are talking, as academics say, intra-ethnic conflicts, which are still there. And I hate to say that, so we should not have many illusions about us being a homogeneous core, white core, fighting for our racial survival. So we got to be aware of that. However, there is one good point, you can say it's an irony of history. As a result of this massive onslaught of foreign clandestine immigrants, particularly from Northern Africa, from Asia Minor, and from Asia and from Africa itself, there is paradoxical now a certain rapprochement between different ethnic European groups, including the Irish and the English or the Scottish, between the Walloons in Belgium and Flemish, who traditionally had very bad relationship with each other. So in all due honesty, we have to admit that those tribal conflicts, those parochial sentiments, we just have to overcome them. Whatever you may think about the United States of America, and I'm just trying to put myself in a different perspective, probably it's to my advantage because I can observe things both from the American perspective and from the European perspective, and on top of it, from the East European perspective. One good point about the United States of America is, particularly if I look at this crowd, the profile of the people here, you are here from different ethnic groups of Europe. So we are all Europeans. Some of you are of Italian origin, some of you are of Spanish origin, some of you are Irish, Scottish, Flemish, and Walloon. And I guess we have to stop there. We are fighting for our survival. We got to forget about those tribal warfares as we have had for 2,000 years in Europe. Because when we make a minority now, we are 8%. I'm talking about white people, white Gentile people, if you wish. So when people ask me nowadays about Croatia, or for that matter, I will be a little bit rude, about Alabama, I certainly love this place. And I love Croatia, where I was born. But what the bottom line is that we have to be concerned with the survival of our people, of our white race, regardless of where they may live, be it in Santiago de Chile, or let's say in Buenos Aires, or be it down under in New Zealand, where I was recently, or in Sweden. Because we are not that many, and we have to stick together. So this is my first conclusion. I don't want to recap what my friend Paul Fromm already said earlier. Ironically, this is another travesty of our destiny. The lowest birth rate in Europe nowadays you have in the very, very Catholic countries. Can you imagine that? Like Spain, Italy, and Croatia. In Croatia, there are almost no children. You see beautiful women, don't get me wrong, I'm not a macho. Beautiful women, they're in their 40s, their 50s, but they have no kids. So this is something we have to take into account, and I will speak about that when I tackle the topic of multiculturalism. Let me now, since we don't have much time, and quite frankly, I would be happy, and I guess I'm also qualified, I would certainly like to speak the whole semester about multiculturalism in Eastern Europe. The main point that you need to know is that in Eastern Europe, ethnic borders, so ethnicities, do not correspond to the real administrative borders. So this was the core problem before the First World War and before the Second World War. Like you still have Czechs, for instance, who do not live within their jurisdictions. You had Germans who lived in Danzig, which was 80% before the Second World War, a German city. And of course, you know what happened with ethnic Germans. I have some relatives there. They're all thrown. There was the massive ethnic cleansing of biblical proportion. And unfortunately, students here are not even aware of what happened to Germans and ethnic Germans after the Second World War. I'm sure most of you will be able to tell me how many Jews were killed during the Second World War, guess, but none of you would be able to figure out how many Germans were killed during and after the Second World War. I'd be very happy if somebody could tell me that. I can give you the right number. It's about 8 million altogether. I'm talking about civilians and soldiers. So this is a substantial number. Having said that, look, let's face it, I'm talking to you, and certainly you may want to have afterwards on a private level, you will ask me some provocative questions. The problem in Eastern Europe in particular is that we lost a substantial part of our gene pool. In Croatia in particular, our middle class in 1945 and 1946 was literally wiped out. And you do not hear about those things. I'm not just talking about the Croats. There were terrible crimes that were committed by communists in Poland and also in Czechia, in Slovakia in particular, in Romania, let alone in Russia. And this is something I need to dwell on for a second, and I'm sorry if I'm just jumping from one topic to another because I'm coming to the core of the problem right away. We need to keep in mind that those populaces, those nations could not develop their middle class. They lost their best gene pool, so to speak, and on top of it, they could not emulate the West. They could not become, quote unquote, the Westerners as we perceive them. Hence the problem that you will probably encounter if you travel now to Russia, some of you who are businessmen, or if you travel to Eastern Europe. You would be surprised to see that many young Croats have an entirely different imagery of the United States of America from what it really is. Most of my colleagues, and I really have a hard time, even nowadays in Croatia, I've been for 13 years now, I have a hard time communicating with them because most of my colleagues, even those who are well educated, and they assume that the United States of America, or for that matter the European Union if you wish, is like a Melrose Place where people can just have fun, smoke dope and drink beer and enjoy themselves. They have this perception of America which does not correspond to its reality, if you can follow me on that. On the other hand, there is another problem. We did get rid of communism. It would be Poland, or for that matter, Croatia, or Czechia, or Slovakia. But now we are literally importing the worst garbage from Hollywood. We are not importing, like the sense of honor, responsibility, and decency. We are importing this broken English mimicry, if you wish, of the worst elements of this decadent culture. So again, if you're a good observer, and I'm sure one of you or some of you will visit Eastern Europe, or for that matter Russia. There are some people who will be in Russia who are quite aware of what I'm talking about. They'll be surprised with the split and almost schizoid mentality of most East Europeans. On the one hand, they desperately want to show that they are certified Democrats, that they will join the European country club pretty soon, that they will become part of NATO. And yet, on the other hand, if you're a good observer and good psychologist, if you have a sense of empathy, both positive and negative empathy, you will always see in the back of their mind this spirit of how to cut the deal, how to cut the corners, this type of mendacity, if you can follow me on that, which was actually inherited from the communist terror. Let me explain it a little bit. Most of us here, most of you here, conceive of communism as a programmatic ideology, as a sort of a political theology, if you wish. And most of you have the imagery of the Gulag killing fields, of Lubyankas, of mass shootings and all the rest. This is for sure. There is empirical evidence on it. But you also have to keep in mind that the communism is also a form of pathology. It's a peculiar type of psychology which left its roots even on my, if you wish, on my distant relatives in Croatia now, despite the fact now that we have a different veneer. Now the veneer is Americanized, it's capitalism, a free market and all the rest, but the bottom line is still pretty much communistic. And I am pretty much pessimistic as far as the future of those post-communist countries are concerned. Again, so just to recap briefly, the problem with ethnic parochial nationalism is still there. Hopefully it will go away, ironically, because of this onslaught of foreign non-European workers and immigrants. And secondly, the problem is also how to actually redefine their identity. That's the problem. How to actually, I mean, we all have problems with identity. I'm pretty much aware that folks here in Alabama also have their identity to a great extent lost, and I feel very sorry for what happened here during the period of Reconstruction. I sort of brag a little bit. I'm pretty much familiar with Southern agrarians, and I know very, very well what happened here. And I hate to say that what happened here during the period of Reconstruction was a blueprint for what happened in Europe 100 years later during the process of communist Frankfurt School brainwashing and all the rest and all the rest. I'm sure you can follow me on that. Let me give you some example. When I grew up in communist Yugoslavia, we were stigmatized as fascist Croats. We were stigmatized as boors, as primitives, hillbillies, as rednecks. And I had some real problems with that myself. Well, this is exactly what happened here in the South, during the period of Reconstruction. So this is something we have to fight against. And here's my minor criticism and, again, my suggestions to all of you. I'm really surprised, and I spoke with some of the nice people that I know, including Sam Dixon and some great fellows here around. I'm surprised that you are not more aggressive in pushing the Southern conservative cultural heritage. You should be more aggressive and proud of your great poets. And the gentleman a while ago, he was talking about slavery. I myself happen to be a fan. I read George Fitzhugh. You know probably George Fitzhugh. He was a great Southern author, antebellum author, and I like his books because he's dealing with the semantics of the English language, and he wrote passages about slavery and the meaning of slavery. And he actually, in a sense, he paraphrased what you said. We are all, to some extent, slaves. And he was very keen about the language. George Fitzhugh, he was by profession, he was a lawyer, he was a linguist, he was also versed in the Latin language, and he was a man of great erudition, and I quote him quite often in my book, so feel free to look at it. And we need, I always ask myself, who defines the language? Who is actually in charge of the political discourse? Even when I read the New York Times, I always want to make sure what is the name of the guy. Is it Lipschitz or is it Dershowitz, whatever the name is? I just want to make sure what his pedigree. This is quite legitimate. I need to know that. Even when I open up the book, the first thing I do is I look at the editor and I ask myself, what is the motive of this guy to use this word slavery or racist or Nazi or fascist or what have you? Keep in mind, if I can just make a little linguistic detour, because after all, this is also my profession, and linguistics and political science. Words are subject to semantic distortions. Nowadays, we take the word democracy as something, glorious, as something really as a role model for all of us. But 60, 70 years ago, democracy, well, even during the French Revolution, the word democracy was used only once. I think also during the American Revolution, I think it wasn't used that, it was used as republic. The word republic was more often used, not democracy. So words over a certain period of time are subject to distortions. Or take the word Nazism and fascism. These are no longer words. They do not connote a certain political meaning. They're the ultimate what? A symbol of ultimate evil. 70 or 80 years ago, these were neutral, not value-loaded words. So I'm also quite keen about that, because most of us here are at least subject to this propaganda. We are being profiled in a negative sense, like bad, fascist, Nazis. And by the way, even the word conservatism, which 20 years ago had a certain respectable reputation, is nowadays somewhat derogatory. It has a somewhat derogatory meaning. And to put it bluntly, what do we have to conserve? There is nothing to conserve to start with. There's decadence all around. Thanks. One more word before I come to the victimology. I hope I'm not running out of time, because I'm trying to condense this, so please do let me know. Look, as far as communism is concerned, I guess you don't have to have a PhD, but try to think a little bit fast, but at the same time try to think logically. I mentioned earlier that communism really ruined our gene pool. I'm sorry to say that. Some of my relatives in 45, 46, they disappeared. There are lots of people. We're talking about humongous number of people who disappeared. The best young people in Europe. It was a terrible civil war, civil literally and metaphorically speaking, that cost us dearly and still does. And one thing you may certainly wonder, how come we never hear about those crimes? And when you hear about those crimes, we hear in a very general manner. By contrast, I'm sure, you open up today's New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN, you will inevitably, on a daily basis, you will hear some minor or major or mega major remark or reference to the Holocaust or to Anna Frank or to some, narrative regarding the Jewish suffering, or for that matter, the fascist, either real or surreal killing. So I guess, once again, even if you were not into some heavy-duty books, you wonder, even when I was a kid, when I didn't know very much about Fitzhugh or Nietzsche or all those big thinkers, I was wondering, why do we never hear about the crimes committed by communists? So again, I wouldn't like to start dropping names because that wouldn't be appropriate, but I would suggest you to buy, if you wish, or you can look at the book of mine, where I'm providing a bibliography and a large number of names. But yes, indeed, if we were to study with a close-up, crimes of communism, we would most likely come up with some very, very disturbing and unnerving conclusions, and I'm sure you know which. Again, I'm not going to quote some revisionist authors because this is not politically correct. I can quote you a guy who is of Jewish origin. He teaches at Berkeley. Yuri Orlov, I think is his name, and he wrote the book, The Jewish Century. You probably know the answer. The more, if we were to approach the study of the communist crimes in a very scholarly and a studious fashion, we would inevitably come to a very painful conclusion. The early Bolshevik movement had a disproportionate number of Jewish scholars and Jewish agitators. And this, as a result, could, in this, as I call it, battle of memories, or let's put it more, crudely, in the battle of body counts, this could certainly overshadow their discourse, as the modern academics say. I'm sure you can follow me on that. So we are here having two different victimologies, and of course, it has to be the first on the top of the list with his own victimology. So this is, in my view, the main reason you don't hear story about what happened to really our best people, our women, men in 45 who were carted off to different places in Siberia and who were killed on spot. And just like most of you, my friend James, about good guy, 6'2", and good-looking guy, and it really, it sort of made me feel like we were trying to resurrect our heroes, not our dead. And I felt immediately, I sort of drew, instinctively, I started thinking about many, many potentially young people, if you wish, who never had a chance to grow up, but who were simply slaughtered by communists. And then again, keep in mind, whether we like it or not, that to a large extent, the liberal establishment, proto-communist establishment in the Truman government, especially the Frankfurt School and the people who were sent over there to the provisional government in Germany in 45, 46, they also played a very strong role in overhauling the mind of young Germans. Just for your information, here's a fact. In fact, all German scholars in 45, 46, regardless of their beliefs, be they lawyers or professors, they were subject to what in Germany is called questionnaires by the American provisional government. So they had to fill out 125 questions, even regarding their sexual habits and this and that. Very demeaning, very appalling type of a brainwashing that occurred in 45. And this was prior to the setup of the Nuremberg Tribunal. So the first target of quote-unquote liberators in 45, 46 was the high school education in Germany. And not just in Germany. I'm taking Germany as a symbol for the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. And this is probably the reason why nowadays, again, back to the semantics of conservatism, this is probably the reason why young people in particular, when you mention the word conservatism, they usually think about some stupid white idiots who are just either brutes or who are gross or who have no intelligence. And this is very unfortunate because the fact being that we are not masters of our own discourse, this resulted in the fact that the left has a certain romantic connotation, a certain romantic flavor, I can put it. It is always associated with intelligence and with brains, whereas when you mention conservatives, it usually means something, well, old-fashioned, outdated, stupid, sort of a paleo-fascist, something which is contrary to the betterment of mankind. And I've been very keen about this. Hopefully it took me a while to overcome that and to learn that, at least to figure out, to spot my enemies. I guess I wouldn't like to use this opportunity now to do some ethnic profiling of some communists or some feminists, if you wish, you know some of them, because I wouldn't like to sound rude or crude. But yes, indeed, I like observing faces of my enemies, and I like observing faces even of some advocates of feminism, Betty Friedan and Susan Sontag, and you name it. And well, I guess, don't get me wrong, I apologize in advance. It was remarkably ugly women, so I was wondering what they have to do with this. And it's some, you know, logically speaking, I sometimes wonder whoever dated them in the first place. But so they may have probably expressed their frustrations in sort of a normatively expressing their desires and their ravings in a quote-unquote scholarly fashion. You will find it also with many early Bolsheviks, not later on Bolsheviks. If you study the faces of Bela Kun in Hungary, Anna Pauker in Romania, and I always want to know what exactly motivates people to act in a particular fashion, just like I'm also asking myself every day. I'm asking, what is motivating the gentleman next to me to be here, to take a certain risk, to expose himself even in the publicity, and also paying the price for it. And I guess this is completely legitimate. So what I certainly reject, before I come to the last point, I reject the fact that we are being profiled as fascists, as, you know, bad guys, what have you, as hillbillies, as rednecks. But on the other hand, we are not allowed to ethnically profile our opponents. And what's wrong in saying, and this is the empirical fact, I mean, this is not just here in the American prison system. You know, most of you, that 70% of inmates are of non-European origin, but this is nothing new in Europe. Of course, you know, you have 50% of inmates are also of non-European origin. So everybody knows that, even the local cops I talk to, but everybody is afraid of saying that aloud. So there is something wrong, there is something pathological about this. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I would slowly like to move now to my, I should say, a rather important issue you may have probably not heard, we haven't spoken about this earlier, and this is this concept of victimology and victimhood. Just as much as I'm unhappy about this victimhood and victimology, it seems to me that these may be some good signs on the horizon which can probably give us some more hope. Let me be a little bit more explicit. Let me give you an idea. First and foremost, from the etymological point of view, you understand that the word multiculturalism is an oxymoron. There is no such thing as multiculturalism. In fact, I'm a multicultural person. I take a great deal of pride that I'm fluent in, and I write German and French as well, and Croatian, of course. But, and I admire foreign cultures. But the word multiculturalism is basically a leftist liberal euphemism for multiracialism. They don't want to use the word multiracial. What we live in is a multiracial society. It's not a multicultural society, because most of those crimes are being committed here in this state, in the United States of America, for that matter in Western Europe, are being committed by very uncultivated and uncultured people of different races. So are we clear on that? I prefer the word multiracialism to multiculturalism. And multiculturalism, please follow me on that from a purely linguistic perspective, presupposes what? Presupposes integration, not assimilation. These are two distinct phenomena. For instance, most Jews in these countries are fully integrated, but they're not assimilated for whatever reasons. We're not going to speculate about that. Now, this is the problem with multiculturalism, that it inevitably spawns this appetite for victimology. So it's no longer just whites versus blacks, or let's say Gentiles versus Jews, or whites versus Jews. As this society is accepting and welcoming more and more tribes, more and more different races from different parts of the world, what goes is the following. What happens is the following. I had a chance even to speak with some Laotian or some Samoans in France. You know, half of Paris is already has changed its color. And they have this rhetorical question: how come, Mr. Sunic or whatever, how come that the Jews are allowed to have their victimology, and how come they're allowed to have their memorial centers? Why not us? And this is very logical. You understand that this logic of multicultural society, being against assimilation, being in favor of integration, it is almost obligatory, be it for the people sitting in the White House or in D.C. or wherever, to attribute a victimhood status to every single ethnic group, whatever their names may be. They can be called Hmongs or Laotians, they can be Filipinos, or they can be Timoris. In Australia, the same thing. In Canada, we have exactly the same thing. In Germany, we have the same thing. And I think, and I don't want to sound like what's the right word in English? Schadenfreude, the Germans say, when you take certain pleasure in someone else suffering. But I guess this can be a boon for us in a sense. Let me give you some empiric examples. 2 or 3 years ago, you may remember there were riots, serious riots, not in Cincinnati, but down in Paris, very serious riots. And there were quite a few graffitis on synagogues in Paris. They were not drawn by proverbial white supremacists, but by Arabs. So there is a serious tension now in France. Well, it's kept underneath. It's kept it's not in the open, but there is a serious tension between French Arabs and Jewish or French Jews. Jews in France, it's the second largest diaspora after the United States of America. They're quite prominent in different fields and higher education as well, and particularly in the media. And yes, indeed, the French Arabs, most of them already naturalized citizens, have often quarrels with them, and there were some lawsuits. And keep in mind that the French Arab intellectuals are quite strong. They have some very powerful minds there. So you see that the whites are sort of out of the loop at this stage. It's more the conflict, that intra-ethnic conflict within different racial groups in Paris. You can see it also in LA as well, or for that matter in New York, that people are sticking to each other. So it's no longer that the whites would be considered a prime target, a prime culprit, but it's more and more those different ethnic groups who are clashing with each other. Because each victimology, and this is my final statement, each victimology is by definition what? It's conflictual. Each victimology, each victimhood searches for the other, because otherwise it cannot function. You have to have this bad other in order to sort of reaffirm your own identity. And in a sense, I see a certain boon, at least for us whites, because in my personal opinion, I don't care if they whack each other, because after all, why should I feel sorry for them? What is victimology? Each victimology, the other side of victimology are guilt feelings. So of course, we are required to wallow in our guilt feelings. Somebody was talking about those atonements and those rituals of atonements, and the Germans do it in a grotesque fashion on the daily basis, on the daily basis. Even to observe their politicians on TV in Germany, after a while you really get oversaturated. And I'm sure, I wonder sometimes, what's crossing the mind of all those German politicians? Why do they constantly have to, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa? We have to do this, we have to send money to Tel Aviv or whatever. We have to do something for the Turks, we have to do for the Kurds, we have to do for all other minorities and all the rest. I'm sure you have the Xerox copy of it in LA and some other multicultural, multiracial areas here in the United States of America. I'm so sorry that I'm condensing this topic in such a fashion, because it's quite complicated and it certainly would need some more time. But basically my main thesis here is that as a result of this multiracial system, there is an inevitable surge of fracturing of the society, of disintegration, or you can call it the balkanization of the society. This is not a normative statement on my part. I fear, and I'm pretty much certain this is going to happen in this country too, let alone in Europe as well, that this country may just as well just break apart and fall apart. Not because of us, but because of different clashes between the Vietnamese and different other groups who are not Europeans, but who are nonetheless no less or no more racist than we are. You understand what I mean? If you talk to I used to live in Algeria when I was a kid. I worked as a translator for a Yugoslav firm when I was a young boy. And I noticed that folks in Algeria up north, the Berbers, they hate the guts of those blacks down south. So do not assume that racism is something we have to feel sorry about. It's a general, racism. I stick to my in-group, I mate with my in-group, I date my in-group, and of course I love my in-group, and I will do whatever it takes, to preserve the livelihood, or for that matter, the gene pool, or for that. My son's name is Eugene, by the way. It's Eugene gene pool of my lineage. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to be long. I would like to end up this discussion with the following. We were talking about political correctness. Professor Wolpin made some very strong remarks, very good remarks. I also enjoyed very much the speech and some comments by my friend Lefebvre, Mr. Lefebvre. He was talking about this iconic imagery, which is very important in our fight against our opponents, against liberals and communists. And of course, we have to become masters of our discourse. But I will probably disagree with some of you. I don't think the system is responsible. It is largely responsible for our ills and for our lot, but we have to start with ourselves. There is no question about that. One thing I can tell you for sure, because I guess I've done some empirical studies on it, I don't want to brag. I noticed one thing about communism, that this was an extremely fragile system, despite the fact that we thought back during the Cold War that they are invincible. It was an incredibly fragile system. You noticed also during the Katrina phenomenon a couple of years ago that the very system where we live right now, can also be very, very fragile. I must also say I've always admired the left. I know them well. I grew up with them. In fact, I went to school with them. I've studied them very much. What I admire with them is that they are far more disciplined, and they are less individualistic than we are, which is another, should I say, hypocritical sign of us. On the one hand, we preach community and helping each other, yet I've never seen so much individualism and so much this vanity, but I'm not going to mention the names, among some of our folks, those, as I said, country club conservatives. And you never see that among the leftists, who are far more better organized. And it has to do something. I don't know if somebody mentioned yesterday on the panel. Yes, Kyle Rogers mentioned the word cowardice. Look, I'm not going to talk about myself now and to go into some self-confessionals. After all, we are not in a Stalin's court. But nonetheless, it takes a certain courage for what we are doing. And I admire what my friend James Edwards said, that look, when you think about our heroes, both here and in Europe, who sacrificed for things, for stakes that were much, much higher than ours, then I guess at least we have to do a minor effort. Whether this is a donation to the Cesspool radio station, or whether this is buying the book, or whether is it attending this conference, that certainly is a positive sign. I will tell you also privately, I'm not going to mention the names. I was a diplomat for a long period of time. I was an academic. I was teaching in different places, giving lectures all over Europe. One thing I really hate is, well, hate, it's a good word that James used a while ago. I meet people, a large majority of them are white people, who will pat me on the shoulder and tell me, oh, Tom, you're a good speaker. You do very well. But they will never come out and back me up, when certain things hit the fan, when things become a little bit difficult. We have to abide by the law, regardless of the fact of what I may think about certain statutes here or certain decrees. Let's forget that. We are actually, what we are interested in is a cultural revolution, cultural hegemony. We have to extirpate it from our friends. I know at least dozens of really folks of staggering erudition, both in Europe and here. It doesn't take much, but it takes a little bit of self-sacrifice. It takes a little bit of what this is all about, the Council of Conservative Citizens. It takes a little bit of resuscitation, if I can say, of our main principles, which is honor and integrity. I was raised in such a family, and I guess it's very dear to me. And finally, let me paraphrase, if I may, my very dear author who I wrote about, and I'm sure you are familiar with that, who encapsulates that in one phrase. You may have heard of Vilfredo Pareto, was a great sociologist of the early 20th century. He wrote both in French and in Italian. He was a great economist, but he understood very well the psyche of socialism, and he wrote very much about the circulation of political elites. And I remember what he quite vividly one he wrote in his book, The Mystique of Socialism. I forgot the name, I'm sorry about this. He said the following: whoever becomes a sheep will find a wolf to eat him. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we gotta stop acting like sheep. Thank you very much for the attention.
Dr. Sunic, I hope you'll stay around. We are going to have an open forum toward the end, an hour or so from now, and someone might want to ask you a question. Our next speaker will be introduced by Tom Doe.